Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this week's first edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight, to go big or not, with 10 days to go before President Cyril Ramaphosa delivers this year's State of the Nation address. One of the big questions is whether he is going to announce a basic income grant. Our panelists are going to weigh in. A big day tomorrow as the Judicial Service Commission starts interviewing candidates for the country's Chief Justice. And a fraudster who exaggerated his qualifications and not only got praises from his bosses, but also raked in more money, is found guilty of fraud. All that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. The first of the four candidates shortlisted to replace former Chief Justice Mogoeng is being interviewed tomorrow. Constitutional Court Justice Mbuyiseli Madlanga will be followed on Wednesday by the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, Mandisa Maya, who will in turn be followed by Gauteng Judge President Dunstan Mlambo. And on Friday, Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo will be the last to appear before the Commission. To look at what is at stake, please welcome from Judges Matter, Mbegezeli Benjamin, and from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution is its Executive Director, Lawson Naidu. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Good evening, Vuyo, and thank you for having us.
It's been a bit of a longish process and done differently this time around, Lawson Naidu.
Indeed, Vuyo, it is done very differently this time around. We've had a public call for nominations for the position of Chief Justice, which happened a few months ago. The President then appointed an independent panel led by Judge Navi Pillay to sift through those nominations that were received. And a shortlist of four candidates was presented to the President by that panel. In terms of the Constitution, the President appoints the Chief Justice as well as the Deputy Chief Justice, but he does so after consulting with the Judicial Service Commission as well as with leaders of political parties represented in the National Assembly. Mm-hmm. So what the President has now done is to submit those four names of the four shortlisted candidates to the Judicial Service Commission, and they will be conducting interviews, as you say, for the remainder of this week into each of those candidates. A whole day has been set aside for each of them to be probed for the JSC to determine the strengths and weaknesses of each of those candidates so that they can present a meaningful report to the President and assist him in making his choice. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to also say that all four of the candidates that are being interviewed have been occupying judicial positions for a significant period of time. They've all been through a JSC process before to be appointed to the bench in the first place. Mm-hmm. So these are, high caliber candidates, I think, that we have being interviewed this week. And the process is going to be interesting to see how the JSC goes about the task that it has and what kind of recommendation it makes to the President at the end of this process.
Mbegezeli, Judge Pillay and her team were widely praised for the way that they've managed this unique process that we haven't seen before. And as Lawson was saying, the caliber of people that it has been able to give the JSC is really one that they could not have done any better. Your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. From what we heard from the presidency, they received about 148 submissions, and they had about 25 names that were put forward for Chief Justice. They went through the process and they drew up a short list of the names that we see today. Of those four, that the president also submitted to the JSC. So one of the things that we've praised about this process is just the competitiveness of the process. The fact that we have 4 really good judges who are all equally capable of being Chief Justice. So basically, we are choosing the best from the best. That is a credit to this process.
And I mean, I'm not going to, form together with you a panel here that's going to talk about who's good, who's strong, and who's most likely to get it. But the point of this conversation is to really remind South Africans of what is at stake here, Lawson Naidoo.
Yeah. So what is at stake is the appointment of the Chief Justice, which is the highest judicial officer in the country. It's also the head of one of the 3 arms of the state. In terms of our constitution, we have the parliament as the legislature, we have government as the executive led by the president, and then we have the judicial branch of government, which is led by the Chief Justice. So this is an incredibly important appointment. And it's not just appointing somebody as the head of the Constitutional Court, but as the head of the whole of the judiciary in South Africa. And with that comes a range of responsibilities, which include presiding over meetings of the Judicial Service Commission in future, determining the tone and manner of the conduct of the JSC, which is responsible both for making recommendations regarding judicial appointments, but also dealing with complaints against judicial officers. And I think we've seen in recent times complaints not always being dealt with as speedily and as effectively as they should be. And so this is one of the responsibilities that the Chief Justice will have. In addition to that, they're also responsible for the management of all of the superior courts in South Africa through the office of the Chief Justice. So it's a wide-ranging set of responsibilities that they have. And I think the 4 candidates that have been shortlisted have different sorts of skill sets and strengths. And I think it's going to be up to the JSC and then ultimately up to the president to weigh those strengths against each other and see which one of the 4 of them, most appropriately fits the demands on this office. And I think, we cannot escape the fact that the judicial branch of government has come under severe political attack in recent months, and in fact, even in recent weeks and days. And, that person who becomes the Chief Justice is responsible for maintaining the integrity and the independence of judicial officers and speaking on their behalf, because judges are not always able to speak publicly on such matters. So that leadership quality is going to be critically important.
And that's what, Mbegazile, I wanted to discuss in a bit of detail, especially coming as these interviews do on the back, of all the, controversies around, ANC leaders, whatever their agenda may be. And the point that Lawson just touched on in his very last comments, that office, and I'm quoting from a government document here, provides support to the judiciary to ensure that it remains independent, accessible and effective in promoting accountability and fighting corruption.
Yes, so I think what you're speaking about is the Office of the Chief Justice, which is a national government department, which the Chief Justice himself has, or herself, I should rather say, has oversight over. And that office is responsible for making sure that the judiciary on a day-to-day basis functions. But I think the crucial part, the role of the Chief Justice is, like Lawson says, to defend the independence of the judiciary and, if necessary, to speak out strongly in defense of the judiciary and also to inspire a sense of integrity within amongst judges to make sure that they lead by example, because, like Lawson says again, judges don't often speak publicly outside of their judgments. And that is for a good reason, because we don't want our judges to be involved in the day-to-day politics of the country. We want them to be involved in making sure that they implement the Constitution and rely on what the law says. So the Chief Justice's position is crucial because he is the one who has an eye over every one of those judicial officers. And if necessary, if the judiciary comes under political attack, as we've seen in the recent past, the Chief Justice is the #1 spokesperson of the judiciary. And so he or she should be able to speak confidently in defense of the judiciary, but also in articulating the values of the Constitution, including equality, dignity, freedom, the rule of law, and judicial independence.
In fact, Lawson, I mean, the line I had started quoting from, which is about or briefly talks about what the Office of the Chief Justice does, continues to say, this is in line with the National Development Plan's vision of promoting accountability and the rule of law, and Priority 5, which is social cohesion and safe communities of government's 2019 to 2024 medium-term expenditure framework. Now, here's why I am, I was reading this part, of that paragraph as well, because on the back of everything that was thrown up by the Lindiwe Sisulu pronouncements or opinion pieces and the subsequent conversations we've seen or heard, is that we don't seem to be actually together, when it comes to whether in fact not that the judiciary is responsible, whether it actually does, or through their judgments and everything else, including how they are running, or the Chief Justice, is running or responsible for the running of the courts, whether in fact we are seeing these outcomes that this part of the Office of the Chief Justice's work should be about.
Yeah, so, I think it's important to stress for you that judges, determine disputes that are brought before them by parties. They don't proactively, act on particular issues, whether they be fundamental issues of the Constitution. They can only do that when they interpret the Constitution and the law and apply it to a dispute that is before them. And they are required to do so in terms of the letter as well as the spirit of the Constitution. So I think the point about candidates for high judicial office, embodying the very principles of equality, dignity, and fundamental human rights for all South Africans is critical. And those are articulated by judges through their judgments and how they interpret the law and the Constitution, as I say. So they're there to interpret that, and not to implement government policy, but they're there to interpret the policy and the legislation in a way that is consistent with the Constitution and seeks to advance human rights in our society. So the notion of seeing the Constitution as a fundamentally progressive document that seeks to extend rights to the people of South Africa is something that we look for in judicial pronouncements and in the courts as a whole. But the one other point I want to make for you as well is the issue of the responsibility of the Chief Justice to ensure that the highest standard of ethics and integrity are displayed by all judicial officers, and to hold them to a very high standard so that the dispensing of justice is seen as free and equal to all. And obviously issues around access to justice also come into play, and that's where the responsibility in terms of the Office of the Chief Justice becomes really important.
Basically, Lawson touched earlier on, the speed with which, judges are able to dispense with matters in front of them. Spoke also about effectiveness. And I remember at that a briefing when the Deputy Chief Justice gave that report, which, although, I mean, in so many ways, it was the report of the former Chief Justice Mogoeng, because it was shortly after, he had left. And among the questions that were raised there was, the quality of some of the judgments, but also the speed with which, judges get to deal with these matters. Just your thoughts on those two issues, which I am dead sure, I mean, will be coming up when these interviews commence tomorrow.
So we are lucky in this country that so many of our judges still maintain the highest standards in terms of the quality of judgments that they produce. The Constitutional Court still produces judgments that are of a high quality and are respected all over the world. But we have to admit that they work under difficult conditions. We know that over the last at least 5 years, there have been gradual budget cuts that are allocated to the judiciary. So the money that judges are require in order for them to do their job has been less and less over a number of years. And so that means the conditions in which they work under are getting more and more difficult. But despite this, despite the higher volume of cases coming before the courts, we still see our judiciary performing at a high level. At that same briefing that you referred to, the acting Chief Justice Zondo mentioned that many of the country's courts, the judiciary, exceeded their own targets. We know that the Supreme Court of Appeal finalized over 80% of the cases that they were allocated for the year, and so the quality of judgments that are still produced by court, is still of a high level. But we also have to raise concerns, though, with the pace at which these judgments come out. The Constitutional Court, for example, over the last couple of years, has taken longer and longer to hand down judgments. There's now one judgment that has taken at least 2 years for it to be finalized. And that does not bode well for the system. And that, again, is something that the Chief Justice must keep an eye on. He must be able to, or she at least, should be able to say that, look, this is unacceptable, and put in place the systems that will make sure that the quality of justice remains is not compromised and remains quite high, but it should move much faster than it currently does.
Well, some people have suggested, Lawson, that part of the problem of the last while is that where the courts ended up having to take over what should have been the responsibilities of the other arms of the state, namely the legislature and the executive. So as a result, they got overburdened, and given the capacity that they were used to, they had to stretch themselves, which meant they had to take a little bit longer. And perhaps in some instances, people thought that the judgments, or how the judgments read, left a lot to be desired.
Well, indeed, but I think, Vuyo, that's only part of the problem. This, clearly, in the last few years, we've seen a number of what may term highly politicized cases coming before the courts through no fault of the courts themselves. As I said earlier, they can only decide disputes that are brought before them by other parties. But there has been an escalation in that. But I think the greater issue, especially when it comes to the Constitutional Court, is the issue of the expansion of the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court in 2013, when it became the apex court for all matters, where previously it only dealt with constitutional matters. It now has a much broader remit in terms of its jurisdiction. So the caseload at the Constitutional Court has increased significantly over the past 8 or 9 years. And that's unlikely to stop anytime soon. And, we have a bench of just 11 justices on the Constitutional Court that are dealing with such an increased volume of cases. So those are some of the reasons why, judgments do take a long time. I mean, it's inexcusable for a judgment to take 2 years to be delivered. But, there needs to be a broader focus from the Office of the Chief Justice, acting in tandem with the Department of Justice, to ensure that we can make use of technological advances and make the processing of cases before the courts much more effective through online case management systems and the like. In the last couple of years, we've seen the courts operating in a virtual environment, hearing matters, many matters in a virtual environment. Obviously, that cannot always be extended to criminal cases that have to be heard in person. But it does show that there is room for improvement. And whilst I fully agree with Mbekazeli about the effectiveness and the quality of judgments, we must always strive to do better and to do more.
Mbekazeli, you know, listening, was it last week, to the arguments that were being put forward by the MPs who serve in Parliament's Public Accounts Standing Committee. There was a point at which one felt, are we not going back to the Zuma years, for lack of a better description, where you had, you know, the governing party's MPs rallying behind the head of state, because some of the arguments that were being advanced for not going one route or the other seemed to have very little to do with the facts that were in front of the committee, but they were more about the positions that the respective political parties held on the matter. And at some point I remember thinking it's going to go the route many of such cases went before, which is that political parties don't agree there, but the governing party bulldozes, and then one of the or two of the political parties or an NGO comes around, takes the matter to court, and then they get to the outcome that would have been logical. I mean, to the approach, the courts then force the legislature to do what the opposition or NGOs would have said is the right way to go anyway. Just from your vantage point, have you had any sort of similar concerns in the last while, or do things point to a new way of doing things where, in other words, the legislature and the executive get to do the right things and not wait for the courts to force them to do the right things?
Well, it's difficult to say conclusively whether the legislature and the executive are moving towards things, doing the right things. But over the last couple of years, you're right that we've seen a lot of issues that should really be dealt with and should properly be dealt with in the more political arms of government, in the deliberative, in a deliberative body like Parliament, end up reaching the courts. Some of them are not it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the Constitution does give the courts quite a wide-ranging power of judicial review. So it's inevitable that there'll be some sort of tension between the judiciary and Parliament. But it's not acceptable that each and every issue suddenly ends up in the courts. It's not sustainable in the long run. As Lawson said, the capacity of the judiciary to deal with all of these issues is limited, and it should really properly be used for those issues that cry out for a judicial remedy or legal remedy. Many of them are not related even to Parliament. They are more related to the day-to-day lives of ordinary South Africans. And so I think it would be an abdication of Parliament's responsibility for them not to allow a space for them to debate and discuss and deliberate on issues and rely on the courts to do their work for them. And I don't think it's a progressive development for that to happen.
In fact, often it's the culprits who are first to cry foul and talk about judicial overreach. But we can't end this conversation, Lawson, before or without me asking you about, I mean, your organization has raised several issues about, as this is going to be a judicial services commission process over the next 5 actually days, including the Saturday when they are going to deliberate, having interviewed all the 4 shortlisted judges. You have raised issues with the way interviews are often conducted.
Yeah, well, indeed, we did. Vuyo, and last year we took up a legal challenge against the Judicial Service Commission for the manner in which it conducted the April round of interviews for candidates for the Constitutional Court. And I think we raised very pertinent issues, because the JSC went way beyond its mandates and what it should be doing in seeking to determine the most appropriately qualified candidates to recommend for appointment to the bench. What we saw was hostile political questioning of judges being questioned about judgments they had given, where some of the JSC commissioners themselves were party to those disputes. Those questions should never have been allowed to be asked in that forum. The JSC is not the forum to settle political scores, as was done on that occasion. I think, though, having said that, with the last round of interviews, when the acting Chief Justice presided over the interviews, we saw a greater level of decorum and a focus on appropriate questioning according to the kinds of criteria that one should be looking for in judicial officers. And we certainly hope that Judge Petzer, who will be chairing this round of JSC interviews, in the absence of the acting Chief Justice and the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, who are both candidates. So it's the Deputy President of the SCA who will preside. And we certainly hope that he will preside in a manner that restores the decorum of this process and respects the dignity of the office for which these candidates are being interviewed, but also respects them as senior judicial officers. They are not there to be rebuked and to be belittled. The questioning should be serious in order, as we said right at the beginning, to determine the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these candidates, so that a meaningful report can be presented to the President, who can then make a decision based on an evaluation of the objective strengths and weaknesses of each of those candidates. So I think eyes will certainly be firmly set on the way the Judicial Service Commission conducts itself during the course of this week.
Mbegazeli, your final thoughts on this very same question?
I 100% echo what Lawson has said. And I would add this, though, that the Judicial Service Commission needs to come up with a set of criteria that it will use to do the job that Lawson has explained now, because part of the reason why the JSC strays into irrelevant and purely political issues that really have nothing to do with assessing whether or not a judge is ready for judicial officer, especially the Chief Justice. The problem is that the JSC really has not articulated what kind of person it wants, and it should start doing so. And so that's the one thing that we would put forward quite strongly, that the JSC should prioritize. And we know that they'll be meeting tomorrow morning, and we hope that that is one of the things that they come out with at tomorrow's at the meeting when the meeting comes out.
Yeah, also to ensure, fairness and things like that, consistency. Those things are just as important. Special thanks to Mbegazeli Benjamin from Judges Matter and Lawson Naidu from KSAC. Of course, here on this channel, SABC, on the SABC News channel, we will be carrying these interviews live. So do stay tuned in. I think they're starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow, if I am not mistaken, but we'll be updating you throughout. After the break, to go big or not, our panel looks at the pros and cons of a basic income grant on the back of reports that President Ramaphosa's advisors are divided on the matter 10 days before he tells us whether or not it's going to happen. Welcome back. President Cyril Ramaphosa's advisors are reportedly divided over the feasibility of introducing the basic income grant. According to a Sunday Times newspaper report published yesterday, the Presidential Economic Advisory Council is divided between those that are steadfast in their view that the country simply doesn't have the fiscal space to incur additional annual spending on the grant, and those, on the other hand, who believe it's both necessary and feasible. Members of the President's Economic Advisory Panel never want to share things they discuss with him publicly, so we had to settle for people familiar with the arguments of either side. And joining us to discuss the two positions are Gilad Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice and David Rood, who is the chief economist at the Efficient Group. Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks very much for your time this evening. Davi, just keen to know what you thought when you saw these reports over the weekend.
Well, not really surprised. Good evening to you. Not really surprised. I think what we are currently seeing is a clash of two things. The one is the ANC ideology, and the other one is the financial reality of South Africa. And maybe I can just put my own position on the table, and that is that in principle, I am against a grant, and a good social security system is a system with fewer people and not more people. But the reality also is that we have very, very high levels of unemployment and poverty in South Africa, and the rest of us simply cannot stand by and see how people are suffering in South Africa. I think it's our moral duty to support South Africans. And the last comment is that we simply do not have the financial means. And we can talk about that as well. I analyze the fiscal accounts quite thoroughly, and I know that is the case indeed. But clearly what we are seeing is a clash between the typical ANC socialist ideology on the one side and the financial reality on the other side.
Gillard?
Hi, evening. I'm sorry, but it's just nonsense. The PEAC report, which argues against the IG, offers no evidence whatsoever. It's a completely ideological posture, which is based on assertion and a very superficial and thin understanding of economic theory. On the other hand, what you have is a mountain of evidence which indicates the viability, feasibility, and necessity of a policy intervention of this kind. So as much as I wish the ANC maybe had a more so-called socialist ideology, this is a clash between a obstructionist view which offers no vision for how to deal with the unemployment, poverty, and hunger, and a mountain of evidence which offers one of a number of policy alternatives.
Davi, if you say that we do, all of us, have a moral duty to help those who are less fortunate than us, how do you propose this be done instead without it falling into the trap you call ANC ideology that don't take into account the reality of the South African situation?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, first of all, that we are dealing with the result of something else. This is the consequence of something else. And what we have in South Africa is very low levels of economic growth. And the reason why I have low levels of economic growth, there are many, many reasons. And most of those reasons have to do with a government with a wrong macroeconomic policy. So the result is high levels of poverty and unemployment. How we should try to fix this, obviously, is to get the economy to grow, which means that we have to implement certain policies that's going to be quite unpopular, especially with institutions like, for example, organized labor, in order to get this economy to grow. In the meantime, we have very, very high levels of unemployment and poverty in South Africa. We've got unemployment of nearly 50% in South Africa. So what should be done in the short term to support our fellow South Africans? And I think there are a couple of things that can be done. One is that we have to cut back on state spending on many things that we're simply wasting money on. One simple example is that we have to close down the Department of Sport. I mean, it's completely silly to have a Department of Sport while people are literally going to bed hungry. So please just close that down. And there are many other departments that we can simply close down. Apart from that, civil servants, as a rule in South Africa, are hopelessly overpaid and underworked. We have to cut back on salaries in civil servants. We're spending massive amounts of money on state-owned enterprises. We have to close those down or privatize that, or whatever the case may be. So those are the kind of things that we need to do in the short term. But on the medium-longer term, what we need to do is to put measures in place to get this economy to grow. And a growing economy will lead to more people employed, and more people employed simply means that there will be few people that are dependent on the state for an income. Maybe I could just mention one or two numbers just to put it into perspective. We have approximately 65 million people in South Africa. we have in South Africa 30 million people that are dependent. That's nearly half of the population in this country that depends on the state for a monthly income. And we have 12 million people that actually are working in the productive sectors in the economy. So those numbers are simply and totally unsustainable. I can give you all the numbers as far as the fiscal accounts are concerned, about state debt levels and the rate of the fiscal deficit and what's going to happen to all of that. So suffice to say that we simply cannot afford it. These sort of numbers simply do not add up.
Gillett, your organization did some number crunching exercise, and I remember when we spoke last year, you had some ideas about where the money could come from. Remind us again.
Excellent, thanks. Before that, let me just say that I think what we've seen here is a classic example of why we are stuck. On the one hand, we have a rhetorical acknowledgement that there is widespread poverty, hunger, that there is huge suffering. On the other hand, when you ask for what should be done, the answer is to reduce spending, increase growth, and ensure employment. Okay. Now, I agree that there's areas where there is room for our budget to reallocate. I am ardently in favor of employment creation, and we need economic growth. But you haven't received an answer to what you're actually asking, right? Which is the fact that there are 10 million or above unemployed people. There are millions of starving South Africans. So what are we going to do now? Because we are not going to create 10 million jobs in the next 3 years. And there is no other policy except for a social distribution scheme which can be a solution to income poverty. And those who oppose an expansion of social security have not offered an alternative of any meaningful kind, which is able to ameliorate the type of social conditions which we face now, which of course, whilst doing that, need to work towards economic growth. As to where to find this, well, what we don't often say is that there's all sorts of other subsidies in our budget which are benefiting rich people. There's about 150 billion rand on private sector retirement benefits for about the top 5% of income earners. There's about 5 billion rand in subsidies spent on employment tax incentives, which is a subsidy to companies. So there's all sorts of other areas where we could reduce the current type of expenditure, and the type of expenditure which favors rich people, and the type of expenditure which is never scrutinized, which is never subject to the same kind of contestation. Of course, over and above that, as you say, we've made proposals of a social security tax, which would raise about 70 billion, which is enough to extend the 350 grant, in the medium term, a wealth tax, an increase on estate duties and other income from wealth, and an increase, for example, of a luxury VAT. So, there was a whole slew of proposals which came to about 260 billion. What we need to do now is drill down into those and sequence those and say, okay, we have this crisis now. We need X amount in distribution, and it'll grow over this period, and it'll be sequenced and implemented in this way.
David, your thoughts? I mean, Gillard listened to you saying we can eliminate waste, get rid of those departments that export, which you regard to be worthless or pointless, hopelessly overpaid and underworked public servants and growing the economy. But he reckons those are not going to work. And then he's put on the table his set of proposals that says you can raise 150 billion rands there, another 5 billion that is being given to companies in the form of subsidies. You can raise another 50 or so, by social security tax. What are your thoughts? The proposal that is raised.
No, these are not my thoughts. These are actual facts. Let me give you some of these actual facts. And now, my good colleague there, he referred to those called subsidies. If you can just point to me in the budget where those subsidies are spent, one single page where these so-called subsidies are spent, that is a lie. Let me repeat that. That is a lie. There are no subsidies like what he is referring to. What he is referring to is that those people that are getting the so-called subsidies are getting some tax breaks to reduce the massive amount of taxes that they are already paying. What you can do, and this is a fact, what you can do, you can go to the Department of Finance and you can just Google it. Go to the Department of Finance and see how many companies pay how much of the total taxes. You can do exactly the same. Go to the Department of Finance at Treasury and see how many individuals pay most of the individual person income taxes, the most important tax to the Minister of Finance. In fact, you can also, and I will show you how to do the calculations, because clearly you do not understand, but my colleagues simply do not understand how the fiscal accounts work. But what I will do is that I will show you how to calculate the redistributional effect of the fiscus. That simply means calculate how much a typical individual at various income categories, how much they pay and what they get back by way of the various taxes. And you will find that the fiscus in South Africa is highly redistributive. In fact, the fiscus in South Africa is perhaps the most redistributive fiscus in the world. So what we can do, we can certainly increase some of these other taxes. We can increase personal income taxes, we can increase companies, we can get rid of some of these so-called subsidies if we do that. But what we will find the next year is that a lot of those taxpayers have immigrated like they are doing already. Less will be saved in the economy as we are doing already. Less will be invested in the economy as we are doing already. And economic growth will go even for a bigger loop as what is currently happening already. I can tell you that we are totally and completely overtaxed in South Africa. Most of the most important tax revenue sources have been exhausted. We cannot increase taxes on things like, for example, personal income taxes and company taxes and some of these other taxes. It is incorrect, and in fact, it's the misrepresentation of the actual fact to suggest that rich people are getting subsidies. That is factually incorrect.
I don't know if you saw, Davi, the NEDLEC report, which found that the introduction of a basic income grant will indeed make a difference. But they, of course, acknowledged that it'll come at a significant cost to the taxpayers. But then they moved to say, but then people have to look at, they didn't use the word trade-offs, but if my correct reading of it was, if my reading of it was correct, then that was a suggestion they were making, that if you reprioritize, you can find a way into basic income grants. Your thoughts?
Yes. In fact, in the current financial year, I'm not going to go into much of the technical details here, but roughly the fiscal deficit in the current financial year is going to be roughly about 6% of GDP. It is significantly lower than previously thought, and the tax overrun in the current financial year could easily be in the region of about 200 billion rand. So the current financial year, which will end the end of March, is actually doing not too badly. So in the short term, perhaps there's a bit of a window where we can, and in fact, I will actually be supportive of extending this, let's call it the COVID grant for another couple of months or whatever. But I must make a very important point. We cannot make this a permanent feature of the budget. Because we just cannot afford these sort of things until we get stronger economic growth. But I absolutely agree with you on the point that there are many places where we can cut back on state spending. And I've mentioned a couple like state-owned enterprises and the normal current expenditure and closing down all departments and stuff like that. There are many places where we can cut back on state spending. But you have to realize, if you cut back on state spending, you're going to have a lot of civil servants, and there are probably around about 2 million of them, that's going to get angry at you if you cut back on state spending. But we also have to be honest in saying that those same civil servants are the people that have been getting above inflation increases for the past 10 years or so. And by the way, that is exactly what the Minister of Finance and the previous Minister of Finance is trying to tell us. That we had, by then, we had 18.5 million people receiving grants, 2 million civil servants, and now another 9.5 million people receiving the special COVID grant. And it doesn't matter how much we argue, how much we need it. The reality is, there is so much money and not more. And somewhere we have to make a political decision that we're going to spend money on A, B, and C, and not on D, E, and F. That is inevitably the political reality, is that you have to cut down on spending in order to fit into the so-called envelope that is available to you. That 2 + 2 is 4. It doesn't matter how you dice it. It's always 4.
Gillard, I have to bring up this one because in your basket of solutions, you speak a lot about tax. The same report says that if your BIG is funded through personal tax, personal income tax, it would result in an approximate average increase in effective tax rates at 8.2%, which is not something you want.
Yes, I don't have that in front of me, but I would not suggest financing this entirely through just a sort of widespread use of income tax across each income tax bracket. I think that there is some room there. I don't know where, Davy, on an anecdotal level, I know when I submitted my tax returns, I received back money for my medical aid and pension. So, those allowances or deductions are very much there. I've got SARS' spreadsheet open in front of me. But anyway, yes, a immediate institution of a significantly large grant for the entire population funded through income tax as an example of a sort of extreme end position is not something which I would support. What I think is getting lost here, though, is also a understanding of the economic benefits of Social Security, and those are significant. They invest in people, in human capital that gets used in education or in starting micro enterprises. It gets used by people in job seeking. Poor people spend a far higher share of their income. They spend it more on locally manufactured goods. They spend it more in local economies. So there is a stimulus from that. And so the economic benefits, including in expanding business, household consumption expenditure, and jobs as an outcome of that, is significant. And it's not a matter of saying this is jobs versus grants. That's a kind of ideological dictum which really makes no sense, right? It's It's a matter of saying, what does a developmental package look like? And what is the relative importance of these various strategies, and where is it complementary?
Okay, we're going to leave it there for tonight. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Special thanks to both of you and for being good sports. Gentlemen, David Roet from the Efficient Group and Gillard Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice. To this now, it may have taken a good couple of years, but a former head of engineering services at the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, Prasa, Daniel Mshushisi Mtimkulu, was today convicted on 3 counts of fraud by the Johannesburg Specialized Commercial Crime Court sitting in Palm Ridge earlier today. Mtimkulu was charged with 9 counts of fraud for allegedly misrepresenting his qualifications to Prasa, claiming, among others, to have acquired a master's degree from the University of Witwatersrand, as well as a doctorate in engineering management from the Munich Technical University in Germany. Here's the NPA's Pindi Mjonondwane.
As a result of this misrepresentation, the rail agency suffered prejudice in that Mtimkulu's annual salary rose from 1.6 million rands as an executive manager to 2.8 million rands that was offered to him by Prasa as a counter offer in September 2010, where he purported to have received a job offer from a German engineering firm for a position as an engineering services specialist at a salary of 2.8 million per annum.
Wow. Well, take a listen to former Prasa CEO Lucky Montana singing Mtimkulu's praises before the whole fraud was exposed.
Daniel will talk. You know Daniel? You see him? Daniel Mtimkulu is our top engineer on rolling stock in the country. It's Dr. Mtimkulu. We invested in him. Many companies in the world wants to have his services, wants to employ him. And I'm very proud that we've been able to keep. He's been leading the team that entered into design process, not only with Transnet, the RSR, but with he's been spending half of his time in Spain in the design of these locomotives. One of the best rolling stock engineers. But maybe it's because he's black, isn't it? That his authority cannot be taken seriously. German companies, he studied in Germany too. German companies want his service to run on maintenance, engineering and everything.
It's not because he was black, it's because he was a fraudster. Live good, clean lives, good people. That's our show for this evening. Join us again tomorrow night, 8 p.m.